Content warning. The Matherson Marriage contains unhealthy relationship dynamics and fictional domestic abuse. If you are in a real-life Matherson marriage, please reach out to the appropriate authorities for help. Resources you may find helpful include the Pixel Project's Domestic Violence Resource page and UN Women's International Helplines list. Resources will be linked in the video description for accessibility. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I'm going to be reading from The Matherson Marriage by Ruby M. Ayres. Chapter 11. Pansy stayed at Lidstow for a week, one of the saddest weeks in her life, but Matherson went home directly the funeral was over. "You don't want me," was the excuse he made to his wife. "You and Violet will be better alone." So he kissed her goodbye cheerfully and drove off, never once turning to look back. "He's glad to go," Violet said bluntly, "and I suppose you can't blame him, but I think he might have stayed for your sake." They went back into the silent house. Already, most of their own personal belongings were packed away, and tomorrow an auctioneer's clerk was coming to make a catalogue of the rest of the furniture. Pansy had appealed to her husband to keep some of it. "What? That rubbish?" he had answered. "My dear girl, it's not worth buying. It's all old-fashioned, early Victorian stuff. For heaven's sake, be sensible." "There are a few things that were Mother's," Pansy faltered, "and Father's old chair." But Matherson was obdurate. "It's just silly sentimentality," he declared. "Sell the lot, my dear, and let Violet have the money. She'll be glad of it some day. I don't want lumber like that in my house." Pansy had once thought the old vicarage the dullest and most uninteresting place in the world, but it seemed like having to stand by while a beloved friend was insulted when, the following day, the auctioneer's clerk listed the things in a way rather contemptuous of their shabbiness. He asked the girls one or two questions. "No silver, I suppose?" It was Violet who answered him sharply. "Nothing that we care to sell, anyway." "I hate him," she confided afterwards to Pansy. "It's not likely I was going to tell him that we hadn't got a bit except our christening spoons, and I believe they're really bladed." The last night in the old house was a bitter one for them both. "It's my home. I shan't belong anywhere after today," Violet said in tears. "You've always got a home while I have one," Pansy comforted her, "and someday you'll marry and have one of your own." She slipped out into the garden, alone presently, and picked a rose from the tumble-down archway, and for a moment she leaned her cheek to the rough, rustic wood. "I don't suppose I shall ever come here again," she thought, as she went back to the house, the rose hidden in her frock. They were to leave early the following morning. "I should just kill everyone if we stayed for the sale," Violet said. "I know just what it will be. The whole village poking its nose in to see just how shabby we were." She shed tears as she said goodbye to each room in turn, and Pansy followed her, sad at heart. "If I'd had the money to take a little house of my own," Violet said fiercely, "I wouldn't have sold a thing. But where can I put them all?" Pansy flushed painfully. "I asked Basil to let me have some," she faltered. "But, well, you know how he hates old stuff. If it's ugly, and ours is, I suppose, from a collector's point of view, so it wasn't any use." Violet hugged her. "I know. I guessed. I'm not blaming you. You've just been a darling," she said affectionately. But they were two very sad faces that looked their last on Lidstow village that afternoon, and they hardly spoke at all during the journey home. "Is anyone going to meet us?" Violet asked as the train stopped, and Pansy started and flushed. "I expect so. I told Basil what time we should come." She was remembering how Lynn had met her the last time she came home, and longed, yet dreaded, to see him waiting for her again. But there was only Gates with the car, not even Matherson, and Violet was loud in her amazement. "I think he ought to have come," she declared. "Pansy, you have brought him up badly." Pansy hardly answered. She was in a state of nervous excitement. Lynn had not written to her while she was away, though she had thought perhaps he might. Once she had begun a letter to him, but had torn it up, afraid. Violet put her head out of the car window as they neared the house. "I can see Buster," she said, "and Joyce. They've seen us, and Buster's waving his hand." No one else?" Pansy asked jerkily. "No." Violet was out of the car almost before it stopped. She looked very young and dainty in her new mourning, and Pansy's heart gave a throb of envy. "I'm old compared with her," she thought, and then forgot everything as Buster flung himself headlong into her arms. "Dodie! Darling Dodie!" "You precious, my beautiful boy!" He would not let her go for an instant. He talked the whole time, asking hundreds of questions and telling her everything he had been doing since she went away. I can say my letters up to nearly the end, he said excitedly, and I can count past 12, and Mr. Lynn gave me a shilling because I cited. Pansy looked at Joyce. What does he mean? She asked. He means recited, Joyce explained, laughing. Mr. Ramsden taught him a little rhyme. He shall say it to you presently. No, say it now, Dodie, Buster appealed. His cheeks were scarlet with excitement, and his eyes shone like stars. Say it now, he insisted, stamping his foot. He's been rehearsing it all the morning, Joyce said. I think he was so afraid he wouldn't remember it at all. Pansy turned away and began taking off her hat. Has Mr. Ramsden been here much? She asked. Joyce laughed dryly. Nearly every day, she admitted. He took Buster and me out in his car one day and back to Chiswell's for tea. We saw the puppies, didn't we, Buster? Buster was thoughtful for a moment. Then he broke out again insistently. Say it now, Dodie. Very well, sweetheart. She sat down on the side of the bed, her eyes fixed adoringly on his flushed face, and Buster began, slowly at first, and rather shyly, but with ever-increasing confidence. Bow, wow, 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 whose dog art thou? I am Tongue Tinker's dog. Bow, wow, wow, wow. Pansy opened her arms. You clever darling. Come and kiss me. Joyce was looking absurdly proud. Mr. Ramsden calls one of the puppies at Chiswell's Tom Tinker, she explained. That's why he taught Buster the rhyme, so he should remember. Say it all again, Buster suggested, magnanimously, but Joyce hastily intervened. Not now. Mother's tired. You shall say it again before you go to bed. Say it again, Buster insisted, then stopped, his face falling as the door opened, and Matherson walked into the room. You've got back, then, he said to his wife. He made no apology for not having met her. Joyce hurried Buster away, and Pansy rose to her feet. Now the excitement of seeing Buster had passed, she realized how tired she felt. Glad to be home? Matherson asked. He put an arm round her. Yes. She kissed him hurriedly. How nice the gardens look, she said, hoping to change the conversation. Lately she had grown to dread Basil more in his affectionate moods than when he was angry. They can't have altered much in a week, he answered. I know. I suppose it's after ours at home. His brows frowned. At home? Isn't this your home? Of course, but somehow, well, I always think of the vicarage as home. Violet is here too, I suppose. Oh, yes, I told you I should bring her. Matherson laughed. Good, because I've asked Ramsden over after dinner. As a matter of fact, I asked him to dinner, but he wouldn't come. Said you wouldn't want visitors directly you got home. I told him it was all nonsense, and that you would both want cheering up. However, he stuck to it, and said he'd look in afterwards for half an hour. Pansy did not answer, and Matherson went away. She was changing her frock when Violet came tapping at the door. May I come in? Of course. Violet went over to the window and opened it wide, leaning out into the garden with a little sigh of pleasure. Pansy, you lucky, lucky girl, she said. Lucky? Why? This lovely house. My bedroom's fit for a queen to sleep in. The lovely gardens. The tons of silver in the dining room. Yes, I've been poking round already. Why, you must have everything in the world you want. Pansy laughed. I haven't. Everything. Violet came back to the dressing table and dabbed her nose with a powder puff. Well, she said, the things you haven't got must be so trifling that you can't possibly feel their loss. Pansy thought of Lynn. Perhaps, she submitted lightly. Violet, you've got too much powder on. Have I? Violet held her pretty hat on one side and criticized her reflection. It's for Lynn's benefit if I have, she explained. Basil says he's coming in after dinner, and I want to look correct. And I know it's correct to look as if you've just had a dip in the flour bin, isn't it? It may be in some places, but it's not here. And I think it's inconsiderate of people to come and call directly we get home, Pansy added with a touch of passion. Her heart was torn with bitterest jealousy, not of her sister, but of her youth and untrammeled freedom. Violet looked surprised. Well, I wouldn't have him here if you don't want him, she said bluntly. But all the same, Pansy, dear, I think a little cheerful society might do us both good. Father, bless him, would have been the last to want us to be unhappy. I know. I'm sorry. I'm a selfish pig. I didn't mean it. Come along. There's the dinner gong. They went downstairs arm in arm, and Matherson, meeting them in the hall, said jokingly, Violet's the living image of what you were the first day I saw you, Pansy. I never saw such a likeness. Which is a compliment to us both. Which is a compliment to both of us, I'm sure, Pansy answered lightly, but her heart sank. What would Lynn think when he saw them together? She dreaded the meeting so much that when she heard his car in the drive, she made an excuse and went up to Buster. Joyce was in his room, folding his clothes, and Buster was sound asleep. Pansy bent over him and kissed his hair. The loveliest thing in all the world, she said. Buster stirred and flung up an arm. I am Tom Tinkerstock, he murmured drowsily. Is Mr. Ramsden downstairs? Joyce asked. I thought I heard his car in the drive just now. He wasn't there when I came up, Pansy answered. She kept her face averted, but her voice sounded a little breathless, and Joyce sighed. I need you to go down, dear, she said presently. Mr. Matherson won't like it if he knows you're up here. I know. I suppose I ought to. But it was some minutes before Pansy could summon enough courage. From the drawing room she could hear voices, and Violet's laugh, then Lynn's voice speaking. Why, you're a little girl in pinafores. She moved then, crossed the hall, and pushed open the door. Basil was over by the window, smoking a big cigar, and Violet sat on the arm of a chair, looking very pretty and excited, talking to Lynn, who stood looking down at her, his back to the door. Violet saw Pansy first and started up. Here you are! I was just coming to fetch you. Lynn says that he's quite sure I can't remember him, as I was only a little girl in pinafores when he used to come to our house. I wasn't, was I, Pansy? I remember him perfectly well. I remember he used to give me sixpence to take notes to you. I remember... She broke off with a smothered laugh as she saw the color rise to her sister's face. Heavens! Have I said anything indiscreet? She asked. You've admitted that you were guilty of bribery and corruption, Lynn said laughingly. He had not glanced at Pansy. After a moment he joined Matherson at the window. My dear, he's a perfect darling, Violet whispered to her sister. You never told me how good-looking he is. Whoever would have thought long-legged old Lynn would grow into such a peach? Pansy winced. I don't think he's altered very much, she said painfully. She sat down on the sofa and took up a magazine, but her hands trembled so she was afraid to turn the pages. Violet joined the men at the window. What a perfectly scrumptious night, she said. She went down the step into the garden. Moonlight, too. How romantic! Lynn, I'll race you across the lawn to the chestnuts. Lynn laughed. I'm too old. Rubbish! Violet came back to him and tugged at his arm. You used to be able to run like the wind at Lidstow, she objected. He gave in then. Oh, very well. They raced off across the soft turf together. Matherson crossed the room to his wife. You never told me Ramsden was an old sweetheart of yours, he said. Didn't I? Pansy looked up. Her face was cold, and her eyes were like gray steel, but she managed to laugh indifferently. Oh, it's so long ago I'd forgotten, she said. The rest of the evening was exquisite torture to Pansy, and at last, unable to bear it any longer, she made the excuse of a headache and went to bed, leaving Violet downstairs with the two men. It was midnight before she heard Lynn Ramsden's car leave the house, and her sister's voice in the garden below calling a cheery goodbye. A moment and Violet was knocking gently on her door. Are you asleep, Pansy? No. Come in. Violet perched herself on the bed. How's the head? She asked, sympathetically, and then, without waiting for a reply, she rushed on. Isn't Lynn ripping? He's going to take me out in his car tomorrow. Pansy found her voice with an effort. Her mouth felt dry. How kind of him to suggest it, she said. Violet laughed. No, he didn't. I suggested it myself, and Basil said he thought it was a capital idea. I see. There was infinite weariness in Pansy's voice, and Violet bent hurriedly and kissed her. I'll go now. I'm selfish keeping you awake like this. Good night. Good night. Violet went away, shutting the door, but Pansy lay awake with burning eyes. This was how it would always be in the future. This was but the first bitter pang of the many she would have to suffer. She could not blame Violet. She could not blame Lynn. It was just life or fate or whatever power governed one's destiny. She took Buster for a walk directly after breakfast the following morning. Aren't you going to wait and see Lynn? Violet asked blankly. Pansy laughed. Goodness, no, I'm not a spoil sport. Silly. but she could hear the pleased note in her sister's voice, and she felt as if she were suffocating. As she followed Buster across the garden. This was how it would always be in the future, and nothing would ever change it. Violet had not returned at lunch, but at tea time she came in flushed and smiling. "I've brought Lynn to tea. I hope nobody minds," she announced calmly. "We had lunch out. Hasn't he got a scrumptious car?" She chatted to Lynn and teased him while they had tea. Apparently they were the best of friends. He's invited us all to dinner the day after tomorrow," she informed Pansy. "Haven't you, Lynn?" "I shall be delighted if you'll come, Mrs. Matherson," Lynn said with an effort. Violet laughed. "Heavens, how formal we are," she objected. "Don't you two call one another by your Christian names?" "I'm afraid I shan't be able to go to dinner," Pansy said constrainedly. Basil's asked some people here, Violet. Some other night, perhaps." "Any night convenient to you," Ramsden said formally. "I'll ask Basil and let you know," Pansy promised. She wondered if there would be one moment during which she could speak to Lynn alone, but Violet never left them. She even went to the door to see Lynn off. "Come again soon," she called after him as he drove away, and Pansy heard his cheery reply. "I shall wear my welcome out at this rate." He did not come at all the next day, and Violet devoted herself to Buster, and Pansy felt a renewed pang of jealousy, for, childlike, Buster turned all his attention to the newcomer. He loved his Auntie he informed her. She was lovely. She played games. It was only Joyce's shrewd eyes that saw the tragedy that was being enacted, and she was powerless to help. She had tried once again since that first night to appeal to Lynn, but he had willfully misunderstood her, and she had given it up. But she loved Pansy, and her heart ached for her as she watched her about the house, resolutely cheerful, always smiling. She had been home 3 days, and had never exchanged a word with Lynn alone, and in her heart she was beginning to blame him. If he had wished, he could have found a way, she told herself bitterly, or he might have written to her. In her pain she was driven to avoid him, and once when, for an instant, they were at last left alone, she deliberately walked out of the room. He should not think she cared. He should not say that she wished for his company. "I've promised Ramsden to take you two girls over to dinner tomorrow night," Matherson said one evening. "He's got some people down from town for the weekend, so we shall be quite a little party." He looked at his wife. "Well?" he questioned. Pansy raised desperate eyes. "Need I go?" she asked. "Couldn't you and Violet?" Then she broke off. "Very well, of course, if you wish it, Basil." "I do wish it, most certainly," he answered. "We've been asked several times, and you've always made an excuse. You might try and look pleased about it." "I'm pleased enough for two," Violet declared. She felt sorry for her sister without knowing why. Since she came to Green Gables, she had realized that everything was not right between Basil and Pansy. The wonderful Matherson marriage, which had been the talk of 2 counties, was not the success that had been expected of it. I'm dying to see Chiswell's," she added. "It's very nice," Pansy said. "Not so large as this, but prettier, don't you think, Basil?" "It's a matter of taste," he answered. "I prefer this myself." "And what shall I wear, Pansy, darling?" Violet asked. "I know it must be black, of course, but do you think it would matter if I put just a little white on my frock somewhere?" "I don't see why it should if you want it," Pansy answered. She turned to the door, but Violet followed and put her arms around her. "Are you cross with me?" she asked in a puzzled voice. Pansy tried to laugh. "Silly child, of course not. Why?" "I don't know, but sometimes, Pansy, you're not unhappy, are you?" "Unhappy?" Pansy drew a long sigh. I think perhaps we're both forgetting Father rather soon," she said painfully. Violet's eyes filled with tears. "How can you? Of course we're not. Just because I don't sit and cry all day. Just because I laugh with Lynn. Pansy, you used to do the same thing once. Only last night he and I were talking about the old days and how fond he was of you." "He was talking about it?" Violet considered. "Well, as a matter of fact, I believe I did most of the talking," she admitted candidly. "But he listened, I know, and once he looked ever so sad, as if he was wishing the past back again. I wonder if he does," she added reflectively. Pansy moved away. "I should say not," she answered. He never had a shilling in those days, and now he's quite well off. Of course, money does make a difference, Violet agreed. Look at you, for instance. Everything the most exacting woman could desire. Yes, Pansy said quietly. Look at me. She went upstairs to say good night to Buster, and was greeted with a demand for Auntie Vi. Tell her to come! Dodie, tell Auntie Vi! Pansy stood looking at her little son with quivering lips. Oh, Buster, won't I do? She asked. He shook his head emphatically. Auntie Vi, he reiterated. Pansy went out onto the landing and called her a sister, and a moment later she heard shrieks of delight from Buster's room, and Violet's cheery voice relating the story of the 3 bears. Pansy stood outside the door listening. She felt old, so old, as if she had left all her youth behind her, with Lynn Ramsden's first kiss that night in Hazel Lane. And that is the end of Chapter 11 of The Matherson Marriage by Ruby M. Ayres. Thank you for listening to this chapter with me, and I hope that you have a great day. Bye!